It's finally here. After 27 years off the futures boards, grain sorghum is coming back to the Chicago Board of Trade, and we're going to be talking all about it in today's episode. Big news just dropped in the agricultural futures markets world, which is going to have major repercussions, not just for Kansas farmers and ranchers, but also for the entire agricultural economy. And that is the impending release of a grain sorghum futures basis contract. Kind of a mouthful, but we're going to get into all the details that you need to know in today's episode. Grain sorghum, or as we call it, MILO, is one of the cornerstone crops that we grow here in Kansas. And Kansas is the leading producer of MILO out of all the states in the United States. With the release of the grain sorghum futures basis contract, Kansas farmers are going to have the opportunity to take advantage of alternative marketing methods, namely hedging, in order to maximize profitability of their grain sorghum crop. And for all of our end users who are using the grain sorghum that we produce here in the Western Great Plains. But first, before we get into all the details of this big news, let's zoom out a little bit and talk about what the role of futures markets actually is in helping us maximize profitability from our farm enterprises here in Kansas. So, for all of us Kansas producers, we know that we are price takers. We don't determine what the price is that we get for the commodities that we raise. We are price takers, as in what the price is the price that we get. Now, that's really challenging because whenever we're making production decisions before harvest, we don't know what the price is going to be whenever we harvest our crop. And if our strategy for marketing our crop is simply taking it to the local elevator and selling it for whatever the price happens to be at the time, then we lose a lot of control and agency over the profitability component of our actual production decisions. One of the ways that we can manage for that is by utilizing futures markets. Now, for Kansas producers who are interested in selling their crop, what they will do by interacting with the futures market is go short, as it's called, which is basically make a commitment to sell a certain amount of grain at the expiration of the contract period. So with corn, for example, one of the major contract expiration periods is December, the DEES corn contract, as we would say. Whenever you go short or sell in the futures market, what you're saying is, I am committing to selling a certain amount of bushels of corn when the December corn contract expires. Now, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, those commitments never are fulfilled because your position in the market, your short position if you're selling a commodity, is offset later in the year by a long position. So basically, you're making the commitment to sell a commodity, and then you're buying back that commitment. It sounds kind of redundant. Why would you sell your commodity in the form of a commitment to sell it at the end of the contract and then just buy it back? Well, the purpose of that is because the price of the contract changes throughout the year. So let's take corn for an example. Let's say that you have 10,000 bushels of corn that you intend to sell after harvest. You're anticipating to raise 10,000 bushels of corn. In that case, suppose that in May, whenever you're planting, you want to go short. You want to make a commitment to sell those 10,000 bushels at $5 a bushel. Imaginary numbers here. Let's say later in the year, the price of corn falls to $4. Now, if you were simply to harvest your corn, take it to the elevator, and accept $4 for it, then you would just be stuck taking $4 for that corn. However, you sold 10,000 bushels as a commitment back in May for $5. So whenever you buy back your commitment to sell at $4 a bushel, you've sold at 5, you've bought at 4. You know what the old adage is: buy low, sell high. You've gained $1. So whenever you go to sell in the cash market, you might sell for $4 a bushel at your local elevator, but you've gained $1 of margin in the futures market. So instead of the $4 per bushel that you would be stuck dealing with by selling just to the elevator, you get $4 at the elevator plus the $1 of profit you made in the futures market. Now, as we know, markets fluctuate up and down throughout the year. So whenever you price that corn at $4 earlier in the year, it's possible that later in that year, that same futures contract could go up to $5, in which case you could be sitting there at the elevator saying, I'm selling my corn for $5 here, but I lost $1 in the futures market. How is the futures market beneficial? Well, the point of the futures market is not to maximize profit per se. The point of the futures market is to mitigate price risk. Because the reality is, when you priced your corn at $4, you didn't know whether or not the price of corn would go up to $5 or down to $3 at harvest. But what you did know is that your costs of production were $4 a bushel, and you priced it at $4, so you broke even. So that's the point of utilizing the futures market, is to manage for price risk. Currently, there's a wide variety of different commodities that can be traded in the futures markets. Among agricultural commodities, the ones that we care about here, there's corn, soybeans, different classes of wheat. In the livestock side, we also have live cattle, fed cattle, lean hogs, there's dairy products, and then specialty crop items that we don't grow here in Kansas, but just kind of demonstrating there's a lot of different commodity contracts that can be traded on the futures market. One that has not been on the market since 1999 is grain sorghum. Now, grain sorghum is not our biggest crop here in Kansas, but Kansas is the biggest producer of grain sorghum. And I can guarantee that you or somebody you know probably grows or has grown grain sorghum in their crop enterprise history. So grain sorghum is an important commodity here in Kansas for us to think about. Since 1999, if someone wanted to utilize futures contracts to manage for price risk, they would have to hedge their grain sorghum on the corn futures market. Now, on the surface, this might make sense. I mean, after all, whenever you look at corn and milo in their vegetative states of growth, they look very similar to each other. They have similar growing seasons. They have similar pricing. If you go to the local elevator, you're going to find that more often than not, the price of corn and the price of milo are usually somewhere in the ballpark of each other. But despite all those similarities, there are quite a few differences in not just how we produce milo versus corn, but how we market milo and corn, and the demand and supply risks and behaviors that influence what the price of corn and milo are locally and in the broader agricultural economy. We had a couple of agricultural economists here at K-State who put together a white paper, or basically a semi-academic paper, outlining all of the explanations for why introducing a grain sorghum futures contract would be beneficial, not just to Kansas farmers and ranchers, but to the broader agricultural economy. And I'm going to be talking about a few of the key points that they indicated whenever they brought this up, and how that discussion finally brought about this reintroduction of a grain sorghum futures basis contract that will be coming later this year. Now, if we want to understand why the grain sorghum basis contract is returning, it helps us to kind of understand a little bit of context of why it went away in the first place. So one of the things that's discussed whenever it comes to futures markets is something called a liquidity trap. See, whenever contracts of commodities are traded, there has to be a sufficient amount of market liquidity in order for it to be a viable product. What do I mean by market liquidity? Basically, what I'm saying is that the price that you see in the futures market is based off of the patterns of buying and selling that are taking place, bids that are being offered for various amounts of the commodity in question. So if there are more people wanting to buy contracts of corn, then you're going to see a price increase. And if more people are wanting to sell off their contracts of corn, you're going to see a price decrease, and so on and so forth. But there has to be enough kind of wiggle room in there, because there's not going to be an equal amount of people who are buying versus selling. For example, whenever a farmer is growing his crop and he plants in April or May, that might be the time of year that he might want to sell a contract of corn or soybeans or whatever he's growing. But that might not necessarily be the same time of year that you have a lot of end users or processors on the other end purchasing contracts. They might do it at different times of the year, or they might have their purchasing patterns distributed throughout the year. And some of that may be based on when prices are advantageous to them. So in order for there to be enough kind of matching up of the selling of contracts and the buying of contracts, there has to be enough trade happening in the system in order for that to take place. Whenever the grain sorghum futures contract was ended in 1999, their explanation for ending was saying there's not enough activity going on in that particular futures market contract to justify there continuing to be a market for it, because it was creating problems with traders who were wanting to buy a contract or sell a contract, because there might not be enough contracts available to be bought or be sold on any particular moment based on the level of trade activity on one side or the other. So that was what they called a liquidity trap. It's not liquid, it doesn't flow, it's not fluid, it's stiff. And if there's no free movement of the commodity contracts in the market, then the entire trading system kind of breaks down. So that's why it went away. Now, we ask ourselves a question now, well, is there enough market liquidity now to justify bringing grain sorghum back? Is grain sorghum production on the rise? To answer that question, the answer isn't as cut and dry as, well, production or trade volume of grain sorghum is now higher than it was in 1999. It's not as straightforward as that, because the solution that's being presented is not a grain sorghum futures contract per se. It's, as I keep saying, this mouthful, a grain sorghum futures basis contract. So what's the difference between a basis contract and just a regular futures contract? A basis contract is basically you are trading not the futures price of grain sorghum per se, but you are trading the price spread between the futures market for corn and a counterfactual futures market for grain sorghum. So if the futures price for corn is $4 a bushel, but the counterfactual for grain sorghum is $3.80, then the basis contract is going to be minus 20 cents. So at the end of the day, we're still anchoring our grain sorghum prices to corn prices. However, we're allowing that differential to flex up and down based on supply and demand, time of the year, and all the different variables that go into determining what's the price of grain sorghum. So by allowing that to happen, we're no longer forcing grain sorghum futures prices to be tied to whatever's going on in the corn market. And those are some of the explanations that were given by our ag economists when they put together this paper discussing why it's important to have a grain sorghum futures contract. Because the production and demand circumstances of grain sorghum are now a lot different, perhaps more than ever before, than the corn market that they've been historically anchored to. So Guy Allen and Dr. Dan O'Brien, who are agricultural economists here at K-State, outline 5 main reasons why introducing a grain sorghum futures contract is beneficial not just for Kansas farmers, but also for the broader agricultural economy. And I'll start with reason number 1. While corn production, to which grain sorghum futures have been historically anchored, is ubiquitous across the central Great Plains and the eastern Corn Belt, grain sorghum production is concentrated in the western grain belt of the United States, where regional crop moisture concerns, drought, crop acreage competition, all of those factors can impact grain sorghum production independently of how those factors would influence corn production in that broader area of the United States. So those production constraints and risks are unique to grain sorghum, yet are not reflected in a corn futures market contract. 2, and this is related to the areas of the country where corn and milo, respectively, are raised. For corn, a lot of the transportation of the commodity to final markets is dependent on barge traffic, particularly on the Mississippi River down to New Orleans and the Gulf of America ports. Grain sorghum, or milo, on the other hand, is a lot more dependent on rail transportation, similar to what we would see in our hard red winter wheat transportation networks. So the supply chain differences, which are a major influence on the differences between our local cash prices that we see at the local elevator and the futures market prices, those supply chain structures are entirely different. I'll give you an example. Just a few years ago, the Mississippi River in October was at record low levels, which was halting a lot of barge traffic. Now, that has a lot of implications on the price for the corn futures price. But grain sorghum transportation, primarily by rail, continued to proceed on schedule. And so the price impact of those respective transportation structures is different between them. 3, export demand for corn and grain sorghum is wildly different. Currently, as last I checked, the number 1 export country for corn from the United States is Mexico. However, grain sorghum, or milo, is typically shipped halfway across the world, or rather, the whole way across the world to places like China and India. So the sources of demand for our exported grain are totally different between corn and milo, and that has an influence on futures market price as well. 4, the current way that the corn futures market contract is set up does not allow producers or consumers who would be purchasing contracts of milo to sufficiently manage for price risk that is unique to milo production and consumption. Right now, their management strategies, their hedging strategies, have to be based on what the price risk is to corn. So that's another reason why it's important to make sure that grain sorghum is able to be traded independently. 5, finally, grain sorghum as a commodity just doesn't fit well within the corn market structure overall. So we know that Guy Allen and Dr. O'Brien have been working closely with representatives from CME Group to explore opportunities for reintroducing a grain sorghum futures contract. But just in the past few days, we've finally gotten confirmation from CME that they are indeed going to be reopening a grain sorghum futures basis contract. It's scheduled to release on August 24th, 2026. That's the first day that trading is going to be available. And like I mentioned, this new contract is not going to be providing a futures price for grain sorghum per se, but rather is going to be showing the price spread between the corn futures contract and a grain sorghum futures contract. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of contracts that are traded in the futures market are offset so that delivery actually doesn't take place. But for those few contracts that do deliver based off of their short or long position. Those contracts are going to be fulfilled using the established Kansas City hard red winter wheat delivery system rather than the corn delivery system, which makes sense considering the overlapping geography of hard red winter wheat and grain sorghum in production and in transportation. Now, similar to the corn contract, because this is still a corn sorghum price spread, the contract expiration months are still going to follow the corn expiration months, with the largest for our area contract expiration month being December. And like with corn and many of our other grain commodities, contracts are going to be traded on a 5,000 bushels per unit basis. So each contract is going to be in units of 5,000 bushels. So bringing this all back together, what's the benefit of this going to be to us here in the River Valley Extension District? Well, I'm going to touch on that simply by going over what we talked about earlier with the fundamentals of the futures market. See, whenever we're raising a crop, if we're only using our cash marketing strategy, that is, harvest your grain, take it to the elevator, and get whatever price you get. Instead, for our MILO producers, we're going to be able to sell contracts of grain sorghum ahead of time based off of our pricing thresholds that we've established for our own farm or ranch. So if we need $3.50 per bushel of MILO to break even on our MILO enterprise, then we'll be able to utilize the futures market in order to correctly time our contracts so that we can make sure that we're maintaining profitability. So in the spring, whenever we are planting our MILO, we'll be able to go short or sell a contract or two of MILO, and then later in the year offset it whenever we're ready to take our harvested crop to the elevator. And by doing that, whether prices rise or fall throughout the year, what we can do is ahead of time in the spring, when we're making our planting decisions and going out and doing the planting ourselves, we'll be able to know what price do I need to hit? What price level do I need to pull the trigger at on this futures contract to make sure I'm putting myself in the best position to have a profitable crop? And now we can do that with all four of our major Kansas crops. I've included a few links with some resources to help us get a little deeper understanding not only of the futures markets, but of the importance of this reintroduction of a grain sorghum futures contract into the mix. But I'd also encourage everyone listening today to sign up for our next iteration of the Winning the Game Grain Marketing Workshop. It's going to be as a webinar on Monday, August 3rd from noon to 1. And I'll include the sign-up information in the description to this video.